Welcome back, Wonders. It's Naidra. Season 7 so far has been a lot of fun, and I'm loving the variety that I'm seeing out there. I am getting a lot of questions and requests to post an updated endgame version of the Spiritborn build that I had posted previously. And for those of you that are asking, I promise you I will absolutely get to it. I do apologize. I was out last week. It was my birthday. I was celebrating with some friends and some family. I didn't have a chance to play, let alone post any types of builds, but I am back this week and I am going to be hitting it full force. First, I'm going to be bringing to you guys the most OP builds that I've been seeing, specifically the Barbarian build, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have been seeing. I know that there's been other guys that have already posted builds similar to this, but I also wanted to make sure that I bring this to you guys as well. For today, we're going to be doing the HotA Earthquake build, which I've been having a lot of fun with and have been decimating pretty much every endgame content that you can possibly think of. With this build right now, I don't have it fully optimized, and yet I have been able to get through pits really easily. At this moment in time, I'm currently doing pit about 130 with this, and again, it's been pretty easy to do, but you can further optimize this and get this way beyond pit 130, as I've seen some others have been doing as well. So with that said, for today, I'm going to show you guys how this build works as usual, and then we'll take a look at our equipment, our skills, and everything else as well. Before we jump into it though, I do want to say if you guys have not yet subscribed to the channel, that really would greatly help me out, and it would be a great birthday present for me as well. So if you haven't done so, please click the subscribe button below. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive right in and take a look at this build. Alrighty, so before we dive into the pit, I just want to explain really quickly how this build is going to work. What we are doing here is we are using Bash to trigger earthquakes, and same thing with Ground Stomp as well. Once we've triggered those earthquakes, then we can use HotA to cause those explosions that deal the additional fire damage, and that's really what's wiping out our enemies really quickly. So it's pretty simple and easy to use. You are going to be pressing pretty much all of the buttons almost all of the time, so get ready for your fingers to get exhausted pretty quick, but otherwise we are dealing massive amounts of damage. We're dealing billions of damage and potentially trillions, depending on how optimized this build is, but it is extremely OP'd and it's super easy to use as well. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to be triggering our challenging shout along with our war cry, and then we'll start using Bash so we can create those earthquakes along with our ground stomp as well. And then once we've got those earthquakes going, that's when we'll use HotA to trigger those explosions. Now, it does help if we have our enemies grouped up, because then we can take them all out at once instead of having to chase them around. So if you have a method of pulling them in, which we'll take a look at the gear momentarily, but that would be really helpful as well. Now, I am hearing that there are some glitches right now happening with some of the witch powers, which are triggering your primary stats to go up even more than they should. But otherwise, let's go ahead and take a look and see exactly what that looks like once we dive into the pit. And for the purpose of demonstration, we're just going to dive into a quick pit level 100. But like I said, with this current build, I've been able to do up to pit 130 with no problem at all. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and find ourselves some monsters, and we'll go ahead and use our shout, ground stomp, and we can go ahead and cause them to explode. Now, like I mentioned, we want to use Bash a little bit more as well so we can create additional earthquakes, but should be pretty quick and easy to get through this. You should be able to do your pits all within about a minute or so if you're doing level 100 or up to 120. Anything beyond that will take a little bit longer depending on how good you are at grouping up your enemies. So we'll take a look at one more group here really quick, and shouts will cause some earthquakes to happen, and then we should be able to finish most of them off by using our HotA. And like I mentioned, you guys can see we're doing billions of damage pretty easily and pretty quickly with this as well. So now that you guys see how this works, let's go back to town and take a look and see what we're doing to make this happen. All right, so first off, let's go ahead and take a look at our gear. And once again, my gear is not fully optimized, so we're going to be able to take this a lot further than where we're currently at with this. However, even with the current state, we are still doing quite a bit. So starting off with our weapon, we're using a two-handed mace, and for this guy we want to try to get a GA on strength and critical strike damage. However, if you can't get it on both like myself, then either one of those two will work. When we look at our tempering for this, we want to temper on damage while berserking, and we also want to make sure we temper on chance for earthquakes to cast twice. And then when looking at our masterworking, we want to masterwork our chance for earthquakes to cast twice. We want that to happen as frequently as possible. Your earthquakes are what's making the explosions happen as well. So the more of that we have, the more explosions we'll see, which means the quicker we can clear our stuff. Now, taking a look at the aspect for this, we are going to be using the earthquakes aspect, which I think is pretty straightforward. Next up, we're going to take a look at our boots. So for our boots, we are using the Exploiters aspect, and we're going to pair that up with a pair of boots that's got Strength, Maximum Life, and Warcry on it. Now, I haven't gotten one that's got the maximum life, which, as you can see, still has some area of opportunity here. However, it is really important that we have Warcry in here. That is going to help you out quite a bit. Now, looking at our tempering, we are tempering on some movement speed, and then we're going to temper on earthquake size as well. The bigger those earthquakes are, the more damage, again, we're going to be able to do, or at least we're going to be able to hit more enemies at once. So that is going to be super helpful. And then when we masterwork our equipment, we're going to try to get all 3 points into earthquake size. Again, we want that to be as large as possible. Next up, we've got our pants. For our pants, currently I'm using Ariat's Bearing, and the reason for that is because it is maxing out my elemental resistances with the 71% going towards elemental resistance. However, you don't necessarily need this. You can use it because we are not using the Call to the Ancients. This really isn't helping us very much when we look at the aspect. However, taking that additional maximum life, ultimate damage, and resistances does help out. Now, if you've got a pair of pants that currently has strength, maximum life, and a GA on resistance to all elements, that one would probably work even better, because then we can pair it up with our Bull Cathos aspect, which gives you additional earthquake damage as well. So that's eventually the way that I'm going to go with this. However, at this point, in order to make sure that we're surviving, the resistance to all elements is helping. Now, if you do have your legendary pair of pants, I would recommend masterworking the resistance to all elements on that, especially again, if you have one that's got a GA on it, that's going to help you maintain those resistances. And once again, it'll help you out with the aspect as well. So if you don't have that yet, you can use what I'm using here. This has been super helpful. Moving on to our gloves, we are using Fist of Fate with this. If you get one with the GA, try to hit the GA on critical strike chance. And then same thing with masterworking. We're going to masterwork all 3 points into crit strike chance for this one. Next up, we've got our chest armor. Now, this piece is required. This is what allows our earthquakes to explode, so it's really important that we have this guy. Now, if you get one with the GA, I'd recommend trying to get the GA on chance for earthquakes to deal double damage, as I got here. We're going to masterwork all 3 points into chance for earthquake to deal double damage as well. Next up, we've got our helmet. So we are using the Ugly Bastard helmet. When we're looking at GAs, we want to get one that's got a GA on Wrath of Berserker cooldown reduction. We want to use Wrath of Berserker as frequently as possible. And so having the minimum amount of cooldown on there is the most helpful. And then when you're masterworking, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put all 3 masterworking points into Wrath of Berserker. Next up, for our amulet, we are going to be using the intercom aspect for this guy. And for our stats, we're going to be taking strength, maximum life, and movement speed is super helpful. The movement speed is not required for the 3rd stat. However, I am finding that this makes it a little bit easier to group the enemies together and to be able to get around as well. So I found it that that's super helpful, but that one is not required. And then we are going to temper on Ground Stomp cooldown reduction and Wrath of Berserker cooldown reduction as well. Now, when you're looking at masterworking, I would recommend putting all 3 masterworking points into Ground Stomp cooldown reduction. This is going to allow you to use Ground Stomp a lot more frequently, which in turn also means more earthquakes, so that means more explosions as well. Next up, we're using the Ring of Starless Skies. Now, if you don't have the Ring of Starless Skies, that's okay. You can use a different ring with this. You can use a legendary ring, which will have the same stats as our next ring we'll take a look at here. However, this is super helpful in maintaining our primary resource, so we can use more Hammer of the Ancients, and it's going to be super helpful. If you do have the Starless Skies, I would recommend putting all 3 masterworking points into critical strike chance. We want to try to land a critical strike with every single strike that we throw out there. If you don't have the Starless Skies, that's okay. Like I mentioned, you just want to make sure you put an aspect on there that gives you back your primary resource, so that way you can continue using that Hammer of the Ancients. Next up, we've got our second ring. For our second ring, we are going to be taking strength, critical strike chance, and critical strike damage with this. And we are going to be tempering on Wrath of Berserker cooldown reduction. And we're also going to be taking some damage to close enemies for this one as well. Now, as I mentioned previously, if you don't have the Starless Skies, you can get a second ring that's got pretty much the exact same stats that we have here. And then we are using the Bold Chieftains for this aspect for the second ring. But like I mentioned, for the first ring, if you don't have the Starless Skies, just get something that's going to give you your primary resource. And then for our second two-handed weapon that we have here, we're going to be using a pole arm. We're going to be taking some vulnerable damage from this, so it's going to be really helpful. We want to make sure we've got something that's got strength, maximum life, and crit strike damage. And once again, if you can get more GAs on this, it would be great. If not, the critical strike damage GA is extremely helpful. We are going to be tempering on damage to close enemies, and we're also going to temper on heavy hitter. And then when looking at our masterworking, we want to try to hit all 3 masterworking points into heavy hitter here. And then for the aspect for this guy, we are using the incendiary fissures. This is what's going to allow our earthquakes to be converted into fire damage and deal quite a bit more damage as well. So extremely helpful there. Taking a look at our one-handed weapons, we are using the executioner's aspect for the first one, and we want to make sure we've got strength, maximum life, and crit strike damage for this as well. And then taking a look at our tempers, we are going to take earthquake duration for this one and damage to close enemies as well, where all 3 of our masterworking points should be going into earthquake duration. And then for our second one-handed weapon, we are going to take something that's pretty much the same, except we are using the vehement aspect instead. And once again, for our masterworking, we want to try to get all 3 of our masterworking points into earthquake duration. Now, with that said, when we look at our runes for our first two-handed weapon, we are using the Lith and Tech runes so we can get some additional earthquakes going and again, additional explosions along with that as well. For our second two-handed weapon, we are going to be taking the Igni and Ohm rune. This will allow us to invoke our Warcry and deal an additional 15% damage, which is going to be super helpful. Now for our gems, we are going to be using emeralds for our weapons, and we are going to be using rubies for our helmet, armor, and also for our pants. Now, taking a look at our occult gems, we are currently not using any that we need with the exception of Friend of the Bog, which is the one that we have on our amulet. Now, for this, you can decide which ones you want to use or which ones are going to be the most helpful to you. The reason that I have these specific 3 in here right now is because I was actually using this with a different character and I just don't have the materials to create anything else. However, if you want to use something different that'll be more helpful for this build, I would recommend looking at the Moonlight Ward, which will be super helpful if you have the ability to purchase that. And then the other one I would look at is Voice of the Stars. These will help you take this build a little bit further, but like I mentioned, I simply just can't afford it at this time, and I'm just throwing on whatever I can. It is super helpful that these gems do give you both armor and also resistances, in addition to the extra aspect that you get at the bottom too. So with that said, and I will include the correct ones in the planner. If you guys haven't checked out the build planner below, feel free to check it out after this video, but I will include the correct ones that you guys will want to use in the planner below. Now, taking a look at our witch powers, for our unique witch power, we are using Paranado. This does also help group up our enemies, which makes it a little bit easier for us to knock them out all at the same time. I have seen some that are using the cycle, which is really helpful because it's both going to help with damage and also helps with recovery. And the same goes for the Vengeful Spirit. It does take damage before applying damage. So both of these work out really well also, but I am using Paranado specifically for the purpose of being able to draw in those enemies, allowing us to deal those hits a little bit quicker and group them up. Next up, we're using Hex of Spirits. We're also going to be taking Shaken Soul. We've got Soul Harvest, then Aura of Misfortune, and finally we're going to be using Aura Specialization. And then for our expertise, we are currently using a two-handed mace expertise. This is because we are using a two-handed mace. Now, you may also use a two-handed axe for your expertise, which gives you some additional critical strike chance against vulnerable damage, which is super helpful. However, I am finding that the two-handed mace has been super helpful, especially because it is increasing our crit strike damage while we're berserking, which is pretty much happening all of the time. Taking a look at our skill tree, we're going to be taking Bash and just 1 point into Bash and taking it up to Enhanced Bash. And then we're also going to take Combat Bash. Now, we're not using Bash to deal damage. We're primarily just using Bash to generate those earthquakes, so that way we can explode them afterwards, but we are not really dealing damage by utilizing Bash at all. And then we're going to go ahead and move on down to Hammer of the Ancients. We're also only going to be putting 1 point into this. The additional points are coming from our equipment. We're not utilizing this as the damage dealer either. This is just so that we can trigger those explosions. So we just need 1 point into this. we're going to take it up to Enhanced Hammer of the Ancients, and then finish it up with Violent Hammer of the Ancients. We'll also take our way down over to Warpath, where we're going to take 3 points into this, before moving on down to the defensive skills. Now for our defensive skills, we're going to take 1 point into Ground Stomp. We are going to take that up to Enhanced Ground Stomp and finish it up with Strategic Ground Stomp. We then will also take Martial Vigor for 3 points, along with 3 points into Imposing Presence. On the left-hand side, we're going to take 3 points into Belligerence. And then we also want to take 1 point into Outburst, 1 point into Tough as Nails. We're going to take 1 point into Challenging Shout, and 1 point into Enhanced Challenging Shout. Moving our way on down to our brawling skills, we will be taking 1 point into Warcry. We'll take that up to Enhanced Warcry and finish that up with Power Warcry. And then yes, we're going to be taking 3 points into Raid Leader, same thing with Booming Voice, and 3 points into Guttural Yell. And then moving on down, we've got 3 points into Aggressive Resistance and 1 point into Battle Fervor. We'll make our way down over to the Weapon Mastery skills, where we're going to take 3 points into Pit Fighter, 3 points into No Mercy, and 3 points into Slaying Strike. We're also going to be taking 1 point into Thick Skin, 3 points into Counteroffensive, and 3 points into Defensive Stance. And then we'll go ahead and move our way down to our ultimate skills, where we're going to be taking 3 points into Heavy Hitter. We'll then take 5 points into Wrath of Berserker, moving on down to Prime Wrath of Berserker, and lastly, Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. And then we'll finish up our skills by taking Unconstrained for our key passive. And then next up, we've got our Paragon board. For our Paragon board, we're going to start the very first board with the Ire Glyph. And I would recommend grabbing just enough strength with this one so that you can move on to the next board if you're not at this level or higher. Once you get to this level, you do want to max out on all of the strength that's around here. However, we want to make sure we get all 5 boards before we start to max out on all of these surrounding glyphs. But we need just enough so that we can activate the secondary bonus at the bottom. We'll then move on over to our second board, which will be the Weapons Master. And we're going to pair up this board with the Rumble Glyph. We're then going to move over to the right, where we're going to be taking the Decimator board, and we'll pair this one up with the Challenger Glyph. Same idea here, you don't need to get 156 strength right off the bat, you just want enough to get this activated. And then moving on up to the fourth board, we're going to be taking the Blood Rage board, and we'll pair this one up with the Revenge Glyph. And then finally, we'll make our way down to our fifth and our final board, which is going to be Force of Nature. And this one we're going to be pairing up with the Martial Glyph. Now, once you've got all 5 boards and all of your glyphs are activated, then I would recommend going back to the first and the second board, which will give you some additional power-ups here. So for the first board, we want to try to get as much strength as we possibly can, so that way we can get some additional damage while berserking. And then same thing for the second board, you want to get as much strength as possible for some additional earthquake damage as well. And you'll see the Paragon board on the build planner attached as well. Next up, we've got our mercenaries. So for our mercenary, we are taking Rahir. We're going to be taking Ground Slam down to Rahir's Aegis, and then Bastion, and finally, we're going to finish it up with Inspiration. And then for our reinforcement, we are taking Baryana, who is going to be using Bloodthirst, and this will be paired up with Hammer of the Ancients. With that said, that's all I have for you guys for today. Thank you guys so much for joining me and watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please don't forget to do so below. I also plan to make an additional Barbarian build where instead of Hammer of the Ancients, we're going to be using Whirlwind. That is going to be a lot better for AoE versus this is mainly built for bossing, but also works for AoE. So stay tuned for that. Thanks again for joining me, and until next time, Wanderers.